in a distant galaxy, the bustling trade colony of Jorak, 9 thrived on its yearly auction. This wasn't just any auction. It was the one where rare goods, beings, and even skills were traded among wealthy buyers and powerful leaders from every corner of the galaxy. People came from planets far and wide, eager to witness and sometimes participate in the most unusual of trades. And this year, the auction was filled with anticipation, for it promised something that had never been seen before. A human woman, renowned for her culinary skills, was up for bidding. Marla had spent her entire life in this remote outpost, a settlement that was far from the comforts of home. She and her daughter, Elara, had arrived when Marla was young, seeking a place to live after escaping the troubles of Earth. Over the years, Marla's cooking had become legendary. The people of Jorak, 9 had tasted many things, but they had never experienced the joy and warmth that her food brought to their lives. It wasn't just about the flavors. It was about the way she made them feel, like they were home again, no matter where they came from. Her cooking had healed wounds, brought warring factions together, and even comforted the broken-hearted. There were few things more powerful than her dishes, but that wasn't the reason she was here today. Marla had no intention of ever being sold. She was just a mother, trying to make a life for herself and her daughter, far from the dark past she had left behind. Unfortunately, the galaxy didn't always offer the luxury of peaceful living. For years, she had been content, working as a cook for a local restaurant. She'd made a modest living, and Elara, her daughter, had grown into a young woman who was just as strong and independent as her mother. Elara, now 16, had always admired her mother's resilience. Though they lived in a rough world, it had never stopped Marla from providing for her, teaching her to cook, and raising her with love and care. Elara had grown to be protective of her mother, though she never fully understood the dangers that their peaceful life might face. She saw her mother's strength, her ability to make peace with food, and she believed nothing could take that away. But when the auction had been announced, things began to change. The auction had not been the plan, and it certainly wasn't something Marla had agreed to. However, a group of wealthy, power-hungry traders had become aware of her talents and had decided she would be a perfect asset for their growing fleets. There was no negotiation. They simply made an offer too tempting to refuse. The people of Jorak, 9, had few rights, and though the traders respected Marla's abilities, they saw her as nothing more than a prize to be claimed. As the day of the auction drew near, Marla felt the unease in her heart. She had known the auction was inevitable, and now it was too late. Her daughter's worry grew with each passing hour. Marla had kept her calm in front of Elara, but deep down she knew that there was no escaping the fate the traders had prepared for her. They didn't care about the woman behind the food, only about what she could do for them. On the morning of the auction, Marla stood in the holding area, surrounded by other items and beings that would soon be sold. She felt like a prized possession, but her heart remained heavy for Elara. Her daughter stood nearby, watching with anxious eyes, trying to suppress the tears that threatened to spill. The auction hall was grand and chaotic. Lights flashed, loud voices filled the air, and wealthy buyers from all across the galaxy milled about, eagerly waiting to see what they would acquire this time. The traders, who had organized the event, were dressed in elaborate suits, their eyes gleaming with greed. They called for the next item to be brought to the stage. Marla was escorted onto the platform. She stood tall, her dark hair tied neatly behind her, and her hands clasped in front of her. She was an impressive woman, one who had never been defined by her circumstances. Her eyes, sharp and clear, scanned the crowd. Among the hundreds of spectators, a figure caught her attention, a man who stood apart from the others, his presence commanding. He wasn't the type to stand in the spotlight, but there was something about the way he observed everything that made him seem different from the rest. His name was Rykor, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He was known as a warlord, feared and respected across the galaxy for his strength and influence. His ships, vast and powerful, had conquered many worlds, and his reputation had left an indelible mark on those who crossed his path. Yet, despite his power, He was not here to bid for weapons or slaves. No, Rykor had heard of Marla's culinary skills, and it was her cooking he wanted. The warlord was known for many things, but a love for fine food was not among the most talked about aspects of his character. This auction, though, had sparked something in him. He saw her as the key to an ambition he had nurtured for years, a way to unite the fractured factions under his rule. He knew that food could do what weapons could not. As the bidding began, Elara's heart raced in her chest. She stood near the front of the crowd, watching as the auctioneer called out the opening bid. The price was steep, far more than what most of the buyers could afford. But there were those who were willing to pay anything to possess a woman like Marla. The bidding escalated quickly, with each buyer offering more than the last. The girl's hands trembled, and she clenched her fists tightly, feeling helpless. Do they know who she is? Elara whispered under her breath.
Bo! Bo!
She's more than just food, she's my mother. Her voice was barely audible, drowned by the noise of the auction. Marla, though, had heard it. She turned to glance at her daughter, a quiet look of reassurance crossing her face. Marla had always tried to shield Elara from the darker side of life, but she knew that this moment would shape her daughter's future in ways neither of them could predict. Just as Elara was about to break into the crowd, pleading for the auction to stop, Rykor's voice rang out.
I'll take her,
he said calmly, his deep voice carrying over the din of the crowd. Everyone turned to him, surprised. The warlord raised his hand, and the room fell silent. 100 million credits, he stated. The bid was so high it stunned everyone into silence. No one could imagine that anyone, let alone Rykor, would pay that much for a cook. The auctioneer stammered, trying to process the offer. Rykor stepped forward and locked eyes with Marla. Your skills are as powerful as any weapon, he said softly, but loud enough for her to hear. I am offering you more than just a job. I am offering you a chance to bring peace. The auctioneer, still in shock, accepted the bid, and Marla was sold to the warlord. Elara stood frozen, watching her mother step down from the stage and approach Rykor, her heart filled with confusion and uncertainty. What had just happened? Had she made the right choice for her mother? Would they ever be free again? The journey from the auction hall to Rykor's ship was long and filled with uncertainty. Marla sat in a transport vehicle, her eyes fixed on the window as the world outside blurred by. Elara sat beside her, her expression unreadable. She had never felt so lost in her life. The excitement of her mother's bidding had quickly turned into dread as she realized they were leaving the only life they had ever known. Rykor had offered more than they could ever dream of, but it came with a cost. Marla knew the weight of that cost, and though she tried to remain composed, her heart ached for her daughter. She glanced at Elara, who refused to meet her gaze, her eyes locked on the floor of the vehicle. The silence between them was heavy, and the tension was almost unbearable.
What will happen to us now? Elara asked softly, breaking the silence.
Her voice trembled, barely audible over the hum of the vehicle. Marla took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. She didn't want to lie to Elara, but she also didn't want to add to her worry. I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know what to expect. Rykor had promised that things would be different. His intentions were not those of a typical buyer. He hadn't come to claim her as a slave, like so many before him. He had offered a future, one where her culinary skills would be valued, respected, and even celebrated. But Marla wasn't sure what that really meant. She had no idea what Rykor wanted from her beyond the food, and the idea of leaving her daughter behind, even if it was for her own safety, felt wrong in every way. When they finally arrived at Rykor's ship, the starkness of it overwhelmed them. The warlord's vessel was massive, an imposing structure that seemed to dwarf everything around it. The metal exterior reflected the light of the stars, casting an eerie glow across the landing bay. The sheer size of the ship made Marla's stomach turn. She had seen ships like this before, but never up close. never as someone who would be living aboard it. A group of Rykor's men greeted them as they disembarked. They were dressed in black uniforms, their faces stern and unreadable. They didn't look at Marla or Elara with the warmth that the locals on Yorak style 9 had shown them. They were cold, calculating, and their gaze lingered only on the fact that they were escorting their new charge to Rykor's quarters. The ship's interior was as intimidating as its exterior. The hallways were dimly lit, with thick metal walls and floors that hummed with energy. Everything felt militaristic. Every surface was polished to perfection, every corner perfectly squared. There was no comfort here, no place for a family to call home. Marla walked through the corridors trying to keep a steady pace, but her mind was racing. She didn't know what to think, let alone what to feel. There was so much uncertainty, so many unanswered questions. What kind of man was Rykor? What did he really want from her? And what about Elara? Would they ever be safe again? As they reached the central chamber of the ship, Rykor's voice echoed through the corridors, calm and deep. "Bring her to me," he said. Marla looked at Elara one last time, her heart heavy with guilt. She could see the fear in her daughter's eyes, and it made her stomach churn.
"I'll be fine, Elara," she said softly, her voice reassuring but not quite convincing. "You don't have to worry about me."
"I'll figure this out." But Elara didn't respond. She only nodded, her eyes still locked on her mother. She didn't believe her, and Marla couldn't blame her. They entered the large, dimly lit room where Rykor stood, his back to them. He was even more imposing in person, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space. The moment he turned to face them, his cold, calculating eyes met Marla's, and she felt an uneasy shiver run down her spine. But there was something else there, too. A flicker of respect, perhaps? Or maybe it was just the weight of his power. "Welcome aboard," Rykor said, his voice low but not unfriendly. "I trust you're comfortable?" Marla didn't know how to respond. She was far from comfortable, but she didn't want to challenge him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but uncertain. Rykor nodded, as though he had expected this. "I know this is not easy for you, but you must understand your skills are invaluable. My fleet has faced numerous challenges, and food has often been a source of tension among the different factions. What you can provide can change everything." Marla nodded slowly, trying to absorb his words. She knew her cooking had a power that went beyond just taste. She had used it to heal, to comfort, and to bring people together. But she had never imagined it would be used on such a grand scale, for such far-reaching purposes. "I'll do what I can," she said, unsure of whether or not she truly meant it. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she knew she had little choice. Her fate, and the future of her daughter, was tied to this man now, for better or worse. Rykor's gaze softened, just slightly.
"You have my word, Marla. Your talents will not go to waste."
He turned to one of his men, signaling for them to prepare her quarters. "Make sure she's comfortable. We'll need her in the kitchens tomorrow." As the man escorted Marla to her new quarters, she glanced back at Elara, who was still standing in the doorway. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. In that moment, Marla wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be okay. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she didn't know what would happen next. Rykor's ship was vast, and it wasn't long before Marla found herself in a small, modest room with a single bed and a desk. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. Still, it felt like a prison. There were no windows, no view of the stars or the planet below. It was just space, a space she would now have to call home. As she unpacked her few belongings, her mind raced. What would tomorrow bring? Would her cooking really make a difference in Rykor's mission? Would it change anything for her and Elara? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find one of Rykor's men standing outside holding a tray of food.
Rykor has ordered your first meal aboard the ship,
the man said, his expression unreadable. Marla nodded and took the tray, grateful for the gesture, even if it was just another part of the plan. She sat down at the small table, examining the food carefully. It wasn't the most exciting meal, but it would suffice. As she ate, her thoughts returned to Elara. What would become of her? Would she be able to adapt to this life? Would she grow to trust Rykor? Or would she come to resent him? Only time would tell. For now, all Marla could do was take it, one day at a time. The days aboard Rykor's ship passed slowly for Marla. At first, she had been unsure what to expect. The vastness of the warlord's vessel had been overwhelming, and the cold, calculated nature of the crew unnerving. But slowly, she began to adapt. The crew didn't bother her much. They were disciplined and respectful, though distant. She could tell that they weren't interested in getting to know her. They only cared about her skills, her ability to cook meals that would satisfy the needs of the fleet.
Rykor, too, remained an enigma. He would occasionally stop by the kitchens to observe her work, but he rarely spoke much.
He was always polite, but there was something distant in his eyes, something that kept her at arm's length. Marla found herself wondering what drove him. Was it power he sought, or was it truly peace, as he had claimed? At first, Marla had tried to keep her head down, to simply cook and avoid getting involved in any of the deeper politics of Rykor's world. She didn't want to think about the wars or the power struggles or the dangerous missions the ship was often sent on. She just wanted to cook, to feed the soldiers and officers, and to keep her head down until she figured out what her next move should be. But as the days went on, she began to notice something. Her food was more than just nourishment to the crew. It was a kind of bridge. It wasn't just about taste. It was about connection. Marla's cooking brought people together in ways that nothing else could. The soldiers, who had once been gruff and silent, began to talk to one another more. The officers, who had always kept to themselves, started to share stories and laugh over meals. Even Rykor, who had been distant, began to open up in small ways. One evening, as Marla prepared a simple stew in the large kitchen, one of the officers came up to her. He was a tall, quiet man, and his face was lined with the weariness of someone who had seen too many battles. He had been one of the hardest to approach, but now he lingered by the counter, watching her work.
"The food here,"
he said, his voice soft. "It's different. It's not just food. It's like it brings peace, even if just for a moment." Marla paused for a moment, looking at him. She hadn't expected such an observation. She had always believed that food could heal, but she hadn't realized how deeply it could affect people in this environment. "I never thought about it that way," she said, her voice thoughtful.
I just cook because it's what I do.
The officer nodded, his eyes distant. "You've got a gift, a rare one. It does more than fill stomachs.
it fills hearts.
Marla didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't used to hearing such praise. She had always believed her cooking was just a simple skill, something that brought people together when nothing else could. But now it seemed that her ability was being recognized for what it truly was, a way to bring peace and comfort to a crew that had known too much war and pain. The next day, Rykor came to the kitchen while Marla was preparing a meal for the crew. He stood in the doorway, watching her work, his arms crossed over his chest. Marla didn't say anything at first, focusing on the task at hand. She had learned not to feel the pressure of his gaze, even though it still unnerved her sometimes. "You're doing well," he said after a moment, his voice low. Marla didn't look up from her work.
"I'm just cooking."
Ryker's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it was gone too quickly for Marla to be sure.
It's more than that. Your food is changing things.
The crew is more unified, more focused. "I've seen it." Marla didn't know what to say. She had never thought of herself as someone who could bring about change, especially not on such a large scale. She was just a cook after all. But now, with the way the crew reacted to her meals, she was starting to see that, perhaps, Rykor was right. Perhaps food could do more than she had ever imagined. For the first time since arriving aboard the ship, Marla felt something stir inside her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a difference, about using her skills to change things, even in a small way. As the days turned into weeks, Marla began to notice other changes. Rykor's crew, though still disciplined and focused, seemed lighter. There were more conversations at the dinner tables, more laughter, more camaraderie. Marla could see that the food was making a difference. It wasn't just about the meals themselves, but the way they brought people together, allowed them to relax, to share stories, to remember that they were human. One evening, after the meal had been served and the crew had settled into their quarters, Rykor appeared in the kitchen again. He didn't say much, just stood by the door, watching her. Marla had gotten used to him doing this. It was almost like he was waiting for something, but she didn't know what. Finally, after several minutes, he spoke. "You've done something here. Something I didn't expect." Marla stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "I'm just cooking." Rykor's gaze softened, though his expression remained serious.
It's more than that.
I've seen what your food does. You've united people.
You've made them believe in something again. Marla didn't know what to say to that.
She had always believed in the power of food to heal, to bring people together. But this was different. This was more than just the crew of a ship. This was a warlord's fleet, filled with hardened soldiers and officers who had seen their fair share of violence. And now, somehow, through something as simple as a meal, she was bringing them together.
I didn't expect this, Rykor continued, but I'm grateful for it.
Marla didn't know how to respond. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for anymore. But she knew that Rykor's words meant something. Perhaps this was her purpose. Perhaps she was meant to do more than just cook. Perhaps she was meant to help bring peace to a galaxy that had known only war for so long.
As the days continued to pass, Marla's role aboard Rykor's ship grew more important. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She was someone who helped maintain the morale of the crew, someone whose meals had become a symbol of unity and hope. She had found a purpose, one she hadn't expected when she had first arrived on the ship. But as much as things had changed, there was still the question of her daughter. Elara. She had tried to stay focused on her work, but every moment away from her daughter felt like a moment lost. She hadn't seen Elara much since they had first arrived aboard the ship. Elara had been busy exploring the ship, getting to know the crew, but Marla could feel the distance growing between them. One day, after a long shift in the kitchen, Marla decided to find Elara. She walked through the corridors of the ship, past the crew quarters and the observation decks, until she found her daughter sitting alone in a quiet corner of the ship. Elara was staring out at the stars, her expression distant.
"Elara?" Marla said softly, approaching her. Elara turned to face her mother, her eyes filled with an emotion Marla couldn't quite place.
"I'm fine, Mom,"
Elara said quickly, but her voice was strained. Marla sat beside her, not knowing what to say.
"I know this is hard, sweetheart, but we're going to be okay. I promise!" Elara didn't answer right away.
Instead, she looked at her mother, her gaze filled with uncertainty. "Do you really believe that?" Marla paused, unsure of how to answer.
"I have to," she said quietly, "because I believe in you."
"And I believe in what we can do here."
Elara didn't say anything else, but she leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, seeking comfort in the quiet of the moment. Marla held her daughter close, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least they would face it together. Weeks passed, and life aboard Rykor's ship began to feel more routine. Marla had settled into her role as the head cook, though it was far more than just cooking. It was about providing comfort, about offering a small piece of peace in a world that had known too much chaos. Her meals were now the centerpiece of the crew's daily lives, and she could feel the difference in the way they responded. The soldiers who once kept to themselves now smiled more, spoke more freely, and even shared stories over dinner. It was a subtle change, but one that Marla noticed every day. But despite the growing camaraderie among the crew, there was still the lingering feeling of uncertainty. Marla hadn't forgotten why she was here. She had been sold to Rykor, a powerful warlord with a reputation for brutality. And though she had come to understand that his interest in her was not purely for her skills as a cook, there was still much she didn't know about his true intentions. Rykor had never been the kind of man to reveal much about himself. He was always polite, but there was a coldness to him that made it difficult to get close. Marla had tried to observe him from a distance, trying to understand what drove him. But Rykor was a mystery, one she didn't know if she would ever solve. His crew respected him, perhaps even feared him, but they were loyal, and Marla had learned that loyalty was something Rykor valued above all else. It was clear that he held a deep respect for her cooking, but what was it about her that made him treat her differently than the others? One evening, as Marla prepared a special meal for the crew, a dish she had perfected back home on Earth, Rykor appeared in the kitchen again. This time, however, he didn't stay by the door, watching her from a distance. He walked in, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice soft but firm. Marla glanced up from her work, meeting his gaze.
About what? Rykor took a step closer, his eyes lingering on the meal she was preparing.
About the future. About how this ship is run.
How? You're making a difference.
Marla didn't know how to respond. She had never expected to be the catalyst for change on this ship, but it seemed that Rykor was seeing things differently. She had always believed that food could bring people together, but she hadn't realized how much of an impact it could have on an entire crew. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change the course of events, but here she was, playing a role she hadn't planned for. "I'm just cooking," she said quietly, trying to keep the focus on the task at hand. Rykor didn't seem to mind. He took another step closer, his eyes still fixed on her. "You've done more than that. Your food has brought people together in ways I didn't think were possible. I can see the change in my crew.
They're more focused, more unified, and I think that's something we need."
Marla's heart raced at his words. She had never thought of herself as a leader, as someone who could unite people. She was just a cook. But Rykor was right. She had seen the change in the crew, too. They were different now, and it wasn't just because of the meals. It was the sense of peace that came with those meals. The way they allowed the soldiers to forget their battles for just a moment, to remember that there was more to life than war.
"I didn't expect this," Rykor continued, his voice quieter now.
"But I'm starting to believe that you're more important to this mission than I ever thought." Marla didn't know what to say. She had never asked to be important. She had never asked for any of this. She just wanted to cook, to make people feel good, to bring comfort to a world that was often too harsh. But now, it seemed that her simple skill was becoming something much larger than she had ever imagined. "I don't know what you mean," she said, still unsure of where this conversation was headed. Rykor looked at her for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. "I'm offering you something, not just a position aboard my ship, but something greater. I want you to help me. I want you to help me bring peace to this galaxy." Marla was taken aback. She had always thought of Rykor as a conqueror, a man who thrived on power and violence. She had never imagined that he would want peace, let alone ask her to help him achieve it. "I'm just a cook," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know anything about politics or war." Rykor nodded slowly. "But you understand people. You understand what they need. And right now, what they need is someone to bring them together, someone who can show them that there is more to life than fighting. And I think you're the one who can do that." Marla didn't know what to say. She had always believed in the power of food to heal and unite, but this was something different. This wasn't just about making meals for soldiers. This was about being a part of something much larger, something that could change the course of history. But could she really do it? Could she really help bring peace to a galaxy that had known nothing but war for so long? I don't know if I can do what you're asking, Marla said, her voice tinged with doubt. Rykor's expression softened.
I don't expect you to have all the answers.
But I believe that together we can make a difference.
Marla looked at him for a long moment, considering his words. She had never imagined that she would find herself in this position.
She had never thought that her cooking could be used as a tool for peace. But now, she saw that it was more than just food. It was a way to bring people together, to heal wounds that ran deeper than any physical injury.
I'll help, Marla said finally, her voice firm.
But I can't do it alone. I'll need your help too. Rykor smiled then, a small but genuine smile that made him seem less like the distant warlord she had come to know, and more like a man who truly wanted to make a difference.
You have my word.
Together, we will change this galaxy.
The days that followed were filled with planning, with Marla working alongside Rykor and his team to put their vision into action. They began to use her cooking as a way to build bridges between different factions, offering meals to those who had once been enemies. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Marla doubted whether it would work. But every time she saw the crew come together around the table, every time she saw someone smile over a meal, she knew that they were on the right path. And though Rykor remained a man of few words, she could see the change in him, too. He was no longer just the cold, calculating warlord who had bought her at an auction. He was becoming something else, something better. He was becoming a leader not just of his crew, but of something much larger, a force for peace in a galaxy that had known nothing but war. But as much as things were changing, there was still the lingering fear in Marla's heart. What would happen if their efforts failed? What would happen if the peace they were working towards slipped through their fingers? And what about her daughter, Elara? Would she truly be safe in this world? Or would she always be caught in the middle of something much larger than herself? These were questions that Marla didn't have answers to. But for the first time since she had arrived on Rykor's ship, she felt like she was finally doing something that mattered. She was more than just a cook now. She was part of something bigger, something that could change the galaxy, and that, in itself, gave her hope.